endure the unendurable.
The radio sits on a wooden crate, its metal casing dented from travel. The air is still, heavy with humidity. Somewhere in the Pacific, early summer, 1945, barbed wire cuts the horizon into rigid lines. Beyond it, a prisoner of war camp settles into evening. Japanese women sit quietly on the ground, their uniforms faded, their hair tied back with scraps of cloth. Some are nurses, some are civilian auxiliaries, some are simply survivors who had nowhere else to go when the front collapsed. The radio crackles. Static first, then music. A woman's voice rises from the speaker. Clear, confident, unafraid. She sings in English. Not mournful, not restrained. Her voice carries rhythm, warmth, and an ease none of them have ever heard before. The women freeze. In Imperial Japan, female voices did not travel like this. They did not command space. They did not sing freely to unseen listeners across oceans. Yet here it is, uninterrupted, unashamed, alive. No one translates the words. None is needed. What shocks them is not the language. It is the sound of a woman unbound. As the song continues, the silence inside the camp deepens, and with it, the first quiet cracks begin to form in everything these women were taught to believe about the world beyond the wire. To understand why that voice carried such weight, it is necessary to return to the world these women came from, a world deliberately sealed from sounds like this. Imperial Japan entered the 1930s with a rigid vision of order. Society was structured around hierarchy, obedience, and restraint. The emperor stood at the spiritual center of the nation. Loyalty to him was not merely political. It was moral, emotional, and absolute. Individual expression, especially for women, was considered secondary to duty. By the time Japan expanded into full-scale war in China in 1937, this worldview had hardened. The state tightened its grip on information. Newspapers, books, theater, and radio all came under direct government supervision. Foreign influences were filtered, edited, or erased. Jazz, swing music, and Western popular culture were increasingly framed as decadent or dangerous, sounds of moral decay from enemy societies. Radio, in particular, became a controlled instrument. Broadcasts emphasized patriotic music, traditional melodies, military marches, and state-approved programming. Female voices were present, but only within narrow boundaries. Formal, restrained, deferential. Singing existed, but it was regulated, often tied to nationalism or nostalgia rather than individuality. A woman's voice was not meant to assert itself. It was meant to serve. As war expanded across the Pacific after December 1941, this isolation deepened. Japan's leadership feared ideological contamination as much as military defeat. Civilians were taught that the outside world was corrupt, hostile, and morally inferior. American society, in particular, was depicted as chaotic and undisciplined, a place where tradition had collapsed and values were shallow. Women were central to sustaining this wartime image. Millions were mobilized into auxiliary roles. Nurses, factory workers, clerks, communications assistants, and members of the patriotic women's associations. They were trained to endure hardship silently, to support the war effort without question, to accept loss without protest. Even entertainment reflected this discipline. Music emphasized endurance and sacrifice. Lyrics spoke of duty, separation, and the homeland. Emotion was permitted, but only within approved forms. Public joy, spontaneity, or personal desire were viewed with suspicion. By 1943, as Japan began losing ground in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, these controls intensified. Air raids on Japanese cities forced radio broadcasts to focus on morale and reassurance. Information about defeats was minimized or distorted. Many women serving overseas still believed victory was possible, or at least that surrender was unthinkable. Then came 1944. American forces pushed relentlessly across the Pacific. Saipan fell in July. Guam soon after. The Philippines were invaded in October. Okinawa loomed. Entire Japanese garrisons were annihilated or captured. Civilians and auxiliary personnel were suddenly caught in collapsing defensive lines. For many Japanese women, captivity arrived without warning. One day they were serving in hospitals or offices. The next, the front dissolved around them. Some destroyed documents. Some attempted suicide, believing capture was shameful beyond survival. Others surrendered in shock, disoriented by the speed of defeat. When they entered Allied custody, they crossed more than a military boundary. They crossed into a world where the silence they had lived inside no longer held. And that world was already humming with sounds they had never been meant to hear. The collapse of Japan's outer defenses did not happen cleanly. It unraveled in fragments across islands, jungles, and coastlines where civilians had been told the empire would never fall. By late 1944 and early 1945, Allied forces encountered not only soldiers, but entire communities left behind by a retreating military. On Saipan, Guam, Leyte, and later Okinawa, Japanese civilians, including women attached to military units, were swept into captivity in numbers few had anticipated. Some had been evacuated too late. Others had been ordered to remain. Many had simply been forgotten. The Allied response to this sudden influx was improvised but deliberate. The United States military, guided by the Geneva Conventions, separated civilians from combatants where possible. Temporary detention and internment camps were established, often using tents, repurposed buildings, or cleared compounds near secured zones. Food was rationed. Medical care was provided. Order was enforced. What was not enforced was silence. American military culture did not view sound as dangerous. Radios were common equipment, carried by units, installed in command tents, and used to relay news, entertainment, and morale programming. The Armed Forces Radio Service, AFRS, broadcast music across the Pacific. Swing bands, ballads, popular singers, and orchestral arrangements meant to remind American troops of home. In many camps, radios were not intentionally introduced to Japanese prisoners. They were simply present, playing in guard stations, echoing from nearby tents, sometimes left on during work details or evening hours. Music drifted through fences and over wire. For Japanese women, this was unprecedented. Back home, even in peacetime, radios were expensive and shared communally. During the war, broadcasts followed strict schedules and content rules. Here, voices emerged without ceremony. Songs began without announcements. Female singers performed with expressive phrasing, emotional range, and audible confidence. There were no drums of patriotism, no calls to sacrifice, no reverent pauses for authority. Just music. Camp reports and post-war testimonies describe confusion among prisoners. Some believed at first that the voices were recordings made by men, altered through unfamiliar technology. Others assumed they were theatrical performances meant to mock or deceive. The idea that women could sing publicly, casually, to mass audiences without censure was difficult to reconcile with everything they had been taught. Language barriers did not dull the impact. Music crossed those lines effortlessly. Rhythm carried emotion. Tone conveyed freedom. Laughter could be heard in some broadcasts. Improvised phrasing suggested choice, something foreign to lives shaped by command and expectation. American guards, many unaware of the cultural gulf, noticed the reactions. Some described prisoners pausing in their tasks when music played. Others recalled women sitting quietly, listening intently, faces unreadable. There were no overt displays of rebellion, no outbursts. The shift was internal. As weeks passed, Radios became part of the camp's soundscape. News broadcasts reported Allied advances. Music followed. Jazz, swing, vocal standards. Female singers, names unfamiliar to the listeners, returned again and again through the static. The war was still raging elsewhere. Bombardment continued. Okinawa burned. But inside these enclosed spaces, something else was happening. The carefully constructed image of the enemy as morally inferior began to fracture, not through argument, but through melody. And for these women, the question was no longer only about captivity. It was about whether the world they had been shielded from was, in fact, more real than the one they had been raised to defend. For many of the women inside these camps, the war had already taken everything tangible. Homes were gone. Families were unaccounted for. Futures had narrowed to the next meal, the next roll call, the next night survived. What remained was identity, and even that had been carefully shaped by the state. From childhood, Japanese women were taught restraint as virtue. Emotional discipline was praised. Silence signaled strength. Personal desire was something to be managed, not expressed. In wartime, this conditioning intensified. They were expected to endure loss quietly, to serve without recognition, to accept death if necessary. The radio disrupted none of this outwardly. The women did not suddenly speak more. They did not challenge authority. But internally, something stirred. The female voices they heard carried ease rather than obligation. They bent notes freely. They sounded joyful without apology. For listeners who had been taught that public female expression invited moral danger, this was disorienting. The singers did not sound punished. They did not sound diminished. They sounded respected, heard. That realization did not arrive as rebellion. It arrived as curiosity, a private, unsettling thought. Perhaps there were ways to exist beyond endurance. Imperial Japan understood silence as discipline. Quiet classrooms, quiet factories, quiet grief. Noise belonged to ceremony or command, not individuality. Radio broadcasts were carefully moderated to avoid spontaneity. Even music followed structure, cadence, and hierarchy. The Allied broadcasts shattered that discipline without intent. Swing rhythms emphasized syncopation, notes that landed where they were not expected. Jazz phrasing lingered, rushed, or softened at will. Female vocalists played with timing, volume, and emotion. These were not sounds of obedience. They were sounds of choice. Inside the camps, silence had been a familiar companion. It carried shame, fear, and uncertainty. The arrival of music did not replace that silence. It coexisted with it, offering contrast. Some women later described the experience as unsettling rather than comforting. The music did not match the world they were living in. It came from somewhere safe, somewhere intact. That contrast forced awareness. Captivity was not universal. Suffering was not shared equally across the world. The sound of freedom, heard through static, sharpened the reality of loss, but also revealed that another reality existed at all. For years, propaganda had flattened the enemy into caricature. Americans were portrayed as crude, loud, morally empty. Their culture was described as shallow entertainment masking spiritual decay. This image justified endurance. It gave suffering meaning. Music complicated that image. Female singers expressed vulnerability, humor, longing, and affection, emotions the prisoners recognized. The song spoke of love, distance, waiting, and hope. These were not alien themes. They were human ones. The women did not suddenly sympathize with the enemy, but the certainty of moral separation weakened. The enemy had women, too. Women who sang. Women who were heard. Women whose voices traveled across oceans not as warnings, but as invitations. That realization carried quiet danger. If the enemy was not hollow, then the war narrative was incomplete. And if it was incomplete, then everything built upon it required re-examination. The music did not argue. It did not persuade. It simply existed. And in doing so, it opened a space where doubt could breathe. The radios kept playing. The radio was not designed as a psychological weapon in these camps. It was an ordinary tool of modern war, used to relay orders, broadcast news, and keep soldiers connected to home. Yet its impact on the prisoners, especially women, was profound precisely because it was unplanned. In Imperial Japan, technology had been tightly bound to authority. Loudspeakers delivered commands. Radios delivered state-approved narratives. Sound moved in one direction, from power to the public. Here, technology behaved differently. The broadcasts were not aimed at Japanese ears. There was no script meant to convert or intimidate. The women were not the audience. They were accidental listeners. That accident mattered. Because the music was not tailored, it felt authentic. It carried no urgency to convince. It simply flowed. For listeners conditioned to distrust every message, this lack of intent made the sound harder to dismiss. It was not propaganda if no one knew you were listening. The radio demonstrated a different relationship between society and technology, one where sound could exist for pleasure rather than instruction. That realization, quiet and technical, chipped away at the assumption that control was inevitable. Perhaps the deepest shock lay not in the music itself, but in who was allowed to make it. In wartime Japan, women's voices in public space were symbolic. They represented support, sacrifice, and continuity, not autonomy. Even female entertainers operated within boundaries defined by male authority and cultural expectation. The Allied broadcasts violated those boundaries casually. Female singers led bands. They occupied center stage. Their voices were recorded, amplified, and distributed across continents. They were not introduced as exceptions. They were the norm. For Japanese women, this was destabilizing. It suggested that gender hierarchy was not universal, that the limits placed on their voices were not natural laws, but cultural choices. This realization did not translate into immediate empowerment. The women remained prisoners. They remained constrained by circumstance. But internally, the idea of possibility expanded. If women elsewhere could speak and sing freely, then silence was not destiny, it was policy. War often relies on moral simplification. Good and evil, us and them. Music complicated that binary. The broadcast did not celebrate violence. They did not glorify conquest. They did not mock the defeated. They offered something morally neutral, art without agenda. For women raised to believe that morality was defined by national loyalty, this neutrality was unsettling. It suggested that goodness might exist outside the framework of the state. That joy did not require permission. Some listeners reportedly turned away, uncomfortable with what they felt. Others listened repeatedly, drawn to the unfamiliar sense of ease. There was no uniform response, only a shared exposure. The music did not erase suffering. It did not soften captivity, but it introduced a new moral question. If the enemy could produce beauty without hatred, then what, exactly, was this war meant to destroy? That question lingered long after the broadcasts ended, and eventually, it led to a moment where doubt could no longer remain abstract. The war would soon force that reckoning into the open. By the spring of 1945, the war had reached its breaking point in the Pacific. Okinawa burned under constant bombardment. American naval guns thundered day and night. Japanese resistance, though fierce, was collapsing under overwhelming force. The empire's final defensive ring was failing. It was during this period, between April and June 1945, that the experience inside several POW and civilian internment camps shifted from exposure to realization. In camps across Okinawa and the recently secured islands, radios were no longer rare background noise. They became routine. American guards followed the same schedules each day. Morning briefings, evening broadcasts. Music played while equipment was cleaned or meals were prepared. One evening, as dusk settled and the heat eased, a familiar pattern repeated. Static, then a clear female voice. This time, the song was slower, intimate. The singer's tone carried longing rather than celebration. Several Japanese women later recalled this moment not because of the song's title. They did not know it, but because of its emotional clarity. The singer sounded alone, yet unafraid. Vulnerable, yet unashamed. Her voice did not apologize for existing. For women who had been taught that emotional exposure was weakness, this was jarring. The singer did not conceal feeling. She shaped it, controlled it, shared it. That night, something changed. The women began to listen differently. Not passively, intently. They noticed how often female voices appeared in broadcasts. Not once, but repeatedly. Not as novelty, but as presence. News segments followed music. Announcers, men and women, spoke casually, without reverence or fear. And then came the news. Broadcasts reported Allied advances plainly. Cities fell. Units surrendered. Casualties were acknowledged without heroic framing. There was no insistence on invincibility. No divine assurance. For prisoners raised on controlled narratives, this transparency was as shocking as the music. The enemy did not hide loss. It did not sanctify every death. It spoke of war as reality, not destiny. Inside the camp, whispers spread, not of escape or resistance, but of disbelief. Some women quietly questioned guards through interpreters. Others remained silent, processing privately. The war they had believed in no longer matched the one being described through the radio. The decisive realization was not that Japan would lose. It was that the world they had been protected from was not collapsing at all. It was continuing. The songs kept playing. And with each broadcast, the distance between indoctrination and reality narrowed, until the gap could no longer be ignored. That narrowing would soon reach a point of no return. The breaking point did not arrive with an explosion or a command. It arrived quietly, through repetition. By early summer 1945, the women in these camps no longer reacted with visible shock when the radios came on. They did not flinch. They did not avert their eyes. They listened. This was the turning point. What had once felt alien began to feel consistent. Female voices were no longer anomalies. They were part of a functioning society that continued to broadcast music, humor, and ordinary human concerns even as the war approached its end. Then, in August, the tone of the broadcast shifted. Reports spoke of a new weapon used against Hiroshima on August 6th and again against Nagasaki on August 9th. The language was restrained, factual. There was no triumphalism, just confirmation, acknowledgement, consequence. 4 Japanese prisoners. This was the moment where ideology finally collapsed. The empire had promised endurance unto death. The radio described surrender. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's recorded address, his first time speaking directly to the public, was eventually relayed to camps through interpreters and Allied officials. The war was over. Japan had accepted defeat. But for many women, the emotional surrender had already occurred earlier, when the world beyond Japan first revealed itself not as monstrous, but as human. In the days that followed, radios continued to play. Music returned. Female singers filled the air once more, now no longer symbols of the enemy, but reminders of continuity. Life did not end with defeat. It adjusted. Some women wept, not from shame alone, but from the weight of realization. The silence they had lived inside had not been protection. It had been confinement. The war had taken years from them. It had taken futures, families, and certainty. But in its final moments, it also took something else, the illusion that isolation was safety. The radio had delivered that truth without accusation, without argument, just sound. And when the broadcasts ended each night, the camps fell silent again, but it was a different silence now. One filled with questions rather than commands. The war was finished. The consequences, however, were only beginning. The days following Japan's surrender unfolded slowly inside the camps. There were no celebrations, no sudden freedoms. The wire remained. Guards stayed at their posts. Meals were still rationed. But the atmosphere had changed. The women moved differently now. Not outwardly defiant, not openly transformed, but less rigid. The constant tension that had governed posture and speech eased slightly, as if an unseen weight had been lifted. Radios continued to play. With the fighting over, broadcasts shifted toward routine programming. Music filled longer segments. Announcers spoke of demobilization, of ships returning home, of cities adjusting to peace. Female singers appeared frequently, not as symbols, but as ordinary contributors to a society rebuilding itself through sound. For the women listening, this ordinariness mattered. The enemy's world was not triumphantly cruel. It was tired, human, focused on return rather than conquest. That reality conflicted sharply with years of instruction that had framed surrender as annihilation. In camp reports and later testimonies, Allied personnel noted subtle changes. Prisoners asked more questions. Some requested explanations of lyrics. Others asked about the singers themselves, where they were from, whether they had families, whether they performed for soldiers or civilians. These were not acts of admiration. They were acts of curiosity. Curiosity, in this context, was radical. Daily routines resumed under Allied supervision. Medical care improved. Nutrition stabilized. Women who had served as nurses found themselves assisting camp doctors, bridging linguistic gaps. In these exchanges, radios often played in the background, an unintentional constant. Music became part of memory. The songs heard during captivity anchored specific moments. Evening light fading over tents, humid air settling, the low murmur of conversation. Years later, survivors recalled not melodies precisely, but sensations. The feeling of hearing a woman sing freely while knowing their own voice had rarely been allowed such space. For some, this awareness caused pain. For others, it planted resolve. A quiet decision that life, after return, would not simply revert to silence. But return itself was still uncertain. Repatriation would take months. Infrastructure in Japan lay shattered. Cities burned. Families displaced or dead. The women understood that whatever waited for them would not resemble the past. The radio had revealed a future without providing instructions on how to enter it. And as transports were organized and camps prepared for closure, the final stage of this story began, not in captivity, but in what followed. Repatriation did not feel like release. It felt like displacement. When the women were eventually transported back to Japan in late 1945 and 1946, they returned to a country transformed beyond recognition. Cities lay flattened. Food was scarce. Families were fragmented. The emperor was no longer divine. The language of obedience that had once structured daily life no longer carried certainty. For former prisoners, reintegration was quiet and difficult. Their captivity was rarely discussed. Japanese society, grappling with defeat, prioritized survival over reflection. Many women were expected to resume traditional roles without explanation or acknowledgement of what they had endured. The radio, however, had changed. Under Allied occupation, Japan's airwaves opened. Censorship loosened. Western music entered homes, cafes, and public spaces. Female singers, both Japanese and foreign, became increasingly common. Jazz, popular ballads, and variety programs filled schedules once dominated by state messaging. For women who had first encountered these sounds behind barbed wire, the experience was disorienting. What had once been shocking was now normalized. The voices that had unsettled them in captivity became part of everyday life. Yet memory attached itself to context. Some women later described hearing Western female singers on Japanese radios and being transported back to the camps, to the wire, the dust, the quiet evenings where music slipped in uninvited. The songs no longer represented freedom alone. They carried the weight of realization, of loss, of change arriving too late to prevent suffering, but early enough to shape understanding. Few spoke openly about this experience. Post-war narratives focused on destruction and recovery. Psychological shifts were rarely recorded, but traces remain in diaries, oral histories, and scattered testimonies collected decades later. They speak of a moment when certainty dissolved not through violence, but through sound. A moment when ideology failed to withstand something as simple as a woman singing without restraint. The war had ended. Japan would rebuild. New roles for women would emerge, unevenly and slowly. But for those who had sat inside camps and listened, the lesson was already absorbed. Silence had not protected them. Sound had revealed the truth, and that truth would echo long after the radios were turned off. In the end, the story of Japanese women prisoners hearing female singers on Allied radios is not a tale of battles or strategy. It is a story of sound as witness, a quiet instrument revealing truths that no orders, no propaganda, no indoctrination could fully suppress. Music carried more than melody. It carried possibility. It carried the reminder that humanity exists beyond rigid roles, beyond duty imposed by authority, beyond the narrow expectations of wartime ideology. A single voice could fracture years of conditioning, not with confrontation, but with presence. The irony is striking. The war had been fought with armies, bombs, and fleets. Yet one of its most profound impacts on thought, perception, and inner life arrived in the form of a song. The women who listened behind barbed wire experienced a collapse of certainty before the surrender of nations. They understood, in moments measured by chords and rhythm, that the world was wider, more complex, and more human than they had been taught. This moment also illustrates the power of technology intertwined with culture. Radios, invented for communication and entertainment, became unintentional instruments of revelation. Voices, especially female voices, traveled farther than armies, reaching minds that had been walled in by ideology. They proved that influence need not be forceful to be transformative. And so, the lesson endures. Even in war, even amid captivity, the human spirit listens for truth. It recognizes freedom in tone and cadence, long before walls or governments acknowledge it. A song need not carry a manifesto to carry meaning. Sometimes its simplest act, singing, becomes the quietest, most radical testimony of all. The war ended with surrender. But for those who heard the music first, understanding had already arrived. Freedom began in the ears, in the mind, in the heart. And for Japanese women in captivity, that was the beginning of a new world, one note at a time.